Kargil War. This was one of the only wars where two nuclear-armed rivals were directly fighting, making it one of the most dangerous moments in modern history. In 1998, both India and Pakistan openly tested nuclear weapons, and just a year later, they were at war with each other. The fighting began when Pakistani troops, disguised as militants, crossed the border that divides Indian and Pakistani forces in Kashmir, and captured more than 100 positions on the Indian side. From those mountain ridges, they had a clear view of India's main highway, so their artillery could threaten supply lines and cut India off. At first, India thought it was just small groups of insurgents, but as battles grew, it became clear that Pakistan's regular army was heavily involved. India responded with Operation Vijay, sending in 200,000 troops. The Indian Navy also prepared Operation Talwar, a naval move to blockade Pakistan's port city of Karachi. Later, Pakistan's prime minister admitted that if this blockade had gone ahead, the country had only about 6 days of fuel left. During the war, some Pakistani officials hinted that if the war spread, they might use any weapon in their arsenal, which was a veiled nuclear threat. US intelligence even reported that Pakistan had started moving nuclear warheads forward, so India also readied its missiles. On the brink of a full-blown nuclear war, the United States and other world powers decided to step in. President Bill Clinton told Pakistan's leader, Nawaz Sharif, to pull his forces back or face complete isolation. And within weeks, Pakistani troops began withdrawing, and the whole situation de-escalated. That could have ended pretty badly, but imagine being the one making those calls, deciding whether to retaliate or negotiate. That's exactly what you do in Supremacy World War III, the sponsor of this video. It's a free online PvP strategy game where you lead a real country in modern war across the world against up to 99 other players, all happening in real time over weeks. You can build your army with tanks, jets, and submarines and decide whether to team up with others or go solo for world domination. In this season, there's something special. A strange new virus mutates the infected into intelligent zombie variants controlled by a powerful hive mind that launches massive attacks on human strongholds. To fight back, humanity has developed advanced high-tech drone motherships. There's also the introduction of new officers, which are elite commanders with unique abilities and personalities that make your armies even stronger. Based on your strategy, you can choose the ones that fit best for the highest chance of victory. The game is cross-platform, so you can play on PC or mobile anytime, and if you're a new player, you'll get an exclusive gift. One seasonal unit when you start, the Elite Battle Tank. Just click the link in the description and jump into the game. Huge thanks to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring this video. Checkpoint Charlie Standoff. In the autumn of 1961, Soviet and US tanks stood face-to-face in Germany, fully armed, for 16 hours. After World War II, when Germany had been split into two parts, many people living in East Germany were unhappy, as life there was poor. For that reason, they escaped simply by walking across the border into West Berlin, and by 1961, around 2.5 million people had left. Keep in mind that at that time, the Berlin Wall hadn't been built yet. East Germany was falling apart because it was losing so many workers, and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev called the situation simply disastrous. He decided something must be done, and that summer, he met John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev told him that he wanted the US and Western allies to leave Berlin, and he wanted the city to be demilitarized. Kennedy refused, and East German leaders secretly made plans to close the border. On what seemed a normal night of August, East German soldiers suddenly rolled out barbed wire and blocked every street leading into West Berlin. In the following days, they began building what would soon become the Berlin Wall. Families that were divided in the two parts of the city were torn apart, and angry protests broke out. Kennedy decided to not send American forces to tear down the barriers, but to send Vice President Lyndon Johnson and more US troops to West Berlin to show support. The situation got more serious when just 2 months after the wall was built, an American diplomat tried to cross into East Berlin, but was stopped by East German guards at a border crossing known as Checkpoint Charlie. The United States argued that only the Soviets, not the East Germans, had the right to control their movements in Berlin. US General Lucius Clay ordered tanks to drive right up to the checkpoint, and the Soviets answered by sending their own tanks, which stopped just a short distance away. For 16 tense hours, American and Soviet tanks faced each other at point-blank range, with their guns loaded. The order to fire never came, but for almost a full day, the world was in danger. Any small mistake, like a nervous soldier firing too soon or a command being misunderstood, could have started a war that no one could control. Finally, communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev helped calm the situation. A Soviet tank pulled back a few meters. Then an American tank did the same, and one by one, the rest of the tanks followed. Pristina Airport Standoff. In June 1999, just hours after the Kosovo War ended, a small move nearly set off a huge crisis. Russia had wanted its own peacekeeping zone in Kosovo, but NATO had refused. Still, suddenly a bunch of Russian armored vehicles drove out of Bosnia towards Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. Their goal was to take control of Pristina's airport before NATO could get there. For NATO's commander, this looked like a serious challenge, and he gave orders for British and French paratroopers to seize the airport by helicopter to get there before the Russians. However, the officers on the ground resisted. The French pulled out of the helicopter plan, and the British stood down. The Norwegian Special Forces and Britain's SAS were the first into the city, but the Russians still reached the airport first. That evening, NATO's general met with Russia's general, trying to calm the situation face to face. Clark, the commander who had the helicopter idea, still worried that Russia might try to fly in reinforcements using transport planes, so he pressed again to have the runway blocked, but bad weather made it impossible that night. According to Captain James Blunt, who was there, Clark even gave an order to overpower the Russians. Jackson refused, famously saying, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you." In the end, British commanders were only given permission to surround the airfield, not to shut down the runway itself. Meanwhile, the United States pressured neighboring countries. Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania all refused Russia the use of their airspace, which stopped any chance of Russian reinforcements arriving by air. However, there was yet another danger. The Kosovo Liberation Army opposed the Russian presence and could easily have turned the standoff into a firefight. Luckily, though, instead of fighting, talks brought a compromise. Russia dropped its demand for a separate sector and agreed that its peacekeepers would be spread across Kosovo, working alongside NATO rather than controlling their own exclusive zone. The crisis slowly faded, and that October, the airport reopened as a military base, with both NATO and Russian troops guarding it. Stanislav Petrov Incident. We could say that Officer Stanislav Petrov from the Soviet Union saved the world. If it weren't for him, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. That's because on September 26, 1983, just after midnight, alarms went off deep inside a Soviet command bunker near Moscow. The computers showed something terrifying. An American nuclear missile had just been launched, and then 4 more followed. According to Soviet military rules, such a warning meant that the officers needed to prepare an immediate counterstrike. Within minutes, the order could have gone out to launch thousands of Soviet nuclear warheads, triggering a full-scale nuclear war. The officer on duty that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and he had been trained to make his decisions according to what the system said. However, according to his intuition, something didn't add up. A real US first strike, he thought, would never be just 5 missiles. It would be hundreds, maybe thousands, designed to wipe out the Soviet arsenal in one blow. He then checked the ground radar, which luckily showed nothing. So, against all rules and protocol, he made his choice and reported the alarm as false. Not having 100% certainty, he waited anxiously for the next minutes, but nothing happened, so Petrov's gamble had been right. Later investigations revealed what really happened. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled the satellites into thinking missiles were rising from US bases. This happened at a time when US-Soviet relations were at their most dangerous point in decades. Just weeks earlier, Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people, including a US congressman, and NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing II missiles in Europe that could strike Moscow in minutes, so Soviet leaders were convinced that NATO might launch a surprise nuclear attack. Afterward, Petrov was questioned, and they buried the entire incident in secrecy. He was never awarded honors, nor promoted, with the whole world not knowing that he saved humanity for years. Korean War. This was a prolonged war, where the idea of using nuclear weapons was continuously under consideration, and you'll soon understand why. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops, trained and supplied by the Soviet Union, crossed the border with South Korea. The South was completely unprepared. They had no tanks, only a small air force, and their soldiers were trained mostly for fighting small guerrilla groups, not a full-scale war. Within just 3 days, the capital city of Seoul had fallen, and within 2 months, North Korean forces had almost pushed their enemies into the sea, trapping them inside a shrinking area of land called the Pusan Perimeter. The United Nations, led mainly by the United States, threw everything it could into stopping North Korea. This wasn't just a war between the 2 Korean states, but one between the United States and its allies on one side, and China and the Soviet Union on the other. In September, the US launched a pretty risky plan, the landing at Incheon. American Marines and South Korean troops stormed the beaches far behind enemy lines, cutting off North Korea's supplies and forcing them to retreat. UN forces then went north, captured Pyongyang, and pushed all the way to the Yalu River, which marked the border with China. For a short moment, it looked like the whole peninsula might be reunited under the South, but Then China stepped in. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers secretly crossed the Yalu River and launched sudden attacks in October. Their arrival completely changed the war, as US and UN forces were pushed back, and by early 1951, Seoul had fallen again, only to be retaken by the UN just weeks later. After this back and forth, the war slowed down and turned into a deadlock, with trenches being built and both sides fighting around the original dividing line. Due to this stall, at one point, US generals, including Douglas MacArthur, suggested using nuclear weapons against North Korea or China. Bombers were even loaded with practice versions of atomic bombs to prepare for such an order. President Truman admitted the option was always under active consideration. But Washington held back, afraid that dropping atomic bombs would bring the Soviet Union directly into the war and turn Korea into the beginning of World War III. China also prepared itself for the possibility of nuclear strikes, but in the end, no bombs were dropped. The world came very close to nuclear war, but both sides stepped back from the edge. The fighting ended with an armistice, with the two Koreas remaining divided and separated by a heavily armed strip of land called the Demilitarized Zone. No peace treaty was ever signed, which means the war is technically still not finished even today. Able Archer, 83. In November 1983, what was supposed to be just a normal training exercise almost destroyed the whole world. NATO was running its yearly war game, called Able Archer, to test how well its systems would work if a crisis with the Soviet Union ever escalated to nuclear war. However, that year, the exercise looked so realistic that many in Moscow became convinced it might not be an exercise at all, but a cover for a real first strike. To understand why, you need to see the background. In the early 1980s, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were at their lowest point in decades. In this tense environment, Able Archer 83 began, but this time, it wasn't just routine drills. NATO added new coded messages, radio silence to mimic combat conditions, and even brought in political leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl to participate. NATO forces practiced moving step by step through the nuclear readiness levels, from DEFCON 5 all the way to DEFCON 1, the stage just before actually launching nuclear weapons. The Soviet intelligence mistook these moves as actual preparations for nuclear war, and the reaction in Moscow was immediate. Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft were placed on high alert, and the Fourth Air Army began loading nuclear warheads onto planes. Some reports suggest intercontinental ballistic missiles were also prepared. The scariest thing of them all is that at the time, NATO had no idea that the Soviet Union was doing all of this or that they mistook the training for the real thing this badly. What prevented disaster was the choice of a single American officer, Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz. He noticed the unusual Soviet response, but instead of raising NATO's alert to match theirs, something that might have confirmed Moscow's fears, he recommended doing nothing until the exercise ended. It was a gamble, but it avoided giving the Soviets even more fears or a reason to act. On November 11th, when Able Archer ended, the Soviets stood down. Later on, thanks to intelligence from KGB double agent Oleg Gordievsky, the West learned just how close the Soviets had come to believing a nuclear strike was underway. And President Reagan was shocked, admitting he hadn't realized how deeply Soviet leaders feared an American attack. The experience helped push him toward arms control talks with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in the years that followed. Sino-Soviet border clashes. Russia and China are today seen as partners, but it's a relatively new development, and it wasn't always that way. As a matter of fact, it was basically the opposite, and they came close to a full-blown nuclear war about 50 years ago. The two countries were having constant arguments about where exactly the border was, but the first major clash on Zhenbao Island, called Damansky by the Soviets, turned the dispute into a huge crisis. Each side poured troops to the frontier, and after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, China saw Moscow as an even greater threat. After that first clash, hundreds of Soviet troops backed by tanks and helicopters attacked Chinese forces at Tialiketi in Xinjiang. At that point, the possibility of these local fights turning into a wider war was pretty high, and both sides already had nukes by that point. Luckily, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai met in September 1969. They agreed to stop the shooting and return to the previous status quo, even though the two sides kept arguing over the border. China, still suspicious of Moscow, then looked for balance by opening up to the United States. That decision led to Henry Kissinger's secret trip in 1971 and President Richard Nixon's visit in 1972. Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world was at its closest to a nuclear destruction. The United States had placed nuclear-armed missiles in Turkey and Italy, close enough to hit Moscow in minutes. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev then secretly launched Operation Anadir, shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, hidden under cargo covers. Then, an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba. When President John F. Kennedy saw the pictures, he called together his top advisors and they debated options. Some generals pushed hard for bombing the sites at once, but Kennedy refused, as he was worried that such an attack would make the Soviets retaliate, even with nuclear weapons. Instead, Kennedy went on television and announced a sort of quarantine of Cuba, a naval blockade to stop more missiles from arriving. The US military was raised to DEFCON 3, one of its highest alert levels. Then, the standoff escalated quickly. Soviet ships went toward the blockade, and Khrushchev sent one message offering to remove the missiles if the US promised not to invade Cuba, and then another demanding that America also pull its missiles out of Turkey. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro, convinced the US was about to invade, urged Moscow to consider launching a nuclear strike first. The most dangerous day came on October 27th, later called Black Saturday. A US U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Major Rudolf Anderson, the only combat fatality of the crisis. At the same time in the Atlantic, US destroyers dropped depth charges near Soviet submarine B-59, not knowing it carried a nuclear torpedo. The captain prepared to fire the nuke, but one man, Officer Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his consent. That same day, another U-2 accidentally strayed over Soviet airspace in Siberia. Soviet fighters scrambled, and the US responded with nuclear-armed interceptors to protect and guide the U-2 back into US territory. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, that night, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, and a deal was made. The US would pledge not to invade Cuba and quietly agree to remove its missiles from Turkey and Italy. In return, the Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The next day, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled, and weeks later, after US reconnaissance confirmed their removal, Kennedy lifted the blockade. Later revelations showed that over 160 nuclear warheads were already in Cuba, including ones that local Soviet commanders had authority to use if attacked. After all of this, a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was set up so leaders could talk instantly in a crisis. Castro felt betrayed by Moscow, excluded from decisions over his own country, and Che Guevara later said that if Cuba had controlled the missiles, he would have launched them, no matter the cost. Once again, though, I recommend checking out Supremacy World War III, a free online PvP game set in modern war across the globe, where you fight real players and conquer the world one move at a time. Click the link in the description and grab your exclusive starter pack. It includes one free seasonal unit, the Elite Battle Tank, which is worth $25, but only for the next 30 days, so hurry up.